Hello everybody, welcome to the webinar Communication XYZ, Speaking the Language of Your Employees. We'll take you through a webinar today around this topic, looking at a range of different things that we think you'll find particularly interesting. We're going to go through some of the different slides here and make sure we've got a bit of background, but first of all let's actually meet the people that are taking part in this. So my name is George Kotzius, I'm an Enterprise Account Executive at Interact, and I've got my colleague here as well.
Hi everybody, my name's Hayden Smith and I'm an Enterprise Account Director, and it's our pleasure to take you through today's webinar. Like any Interact webinar though, we want to make sure that it's not all one way. We will be doing the lion's share of the work though, won't we?
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you look on your GoToWebinar panel, on the right hand side you'll see a drop down where you can click and expand the question section, and we really do recommend that you throw some questions here. We've got our colleague Emma Bramwell in the corner there looking to pass those over to us, so at the end if we've got enough time we'll at least answer 2 or 3 questions, won't we?
Yeah, absolutely.
Then if we don't have time we can follow up. We've got your details, we'll send you recordings of the event and any responses that come up.
Great, yeah, thanks for that, Hayden. So let's actually talk a bit more about what we're going to cover today, give you a bit of an overview as to why we're doing this and what we're going to go through. So the first point is we wanted to look at some of the trends that are going to be taking place in 2018 in the internal communications industry. There are a couple of points we want to make sure that we raise there to align with most likely the things you're going to be doing in the next year or so.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're then going to have a look at the different generational groups. We talked about the title of this, Generation XYZ, and as you've probably guessed, we're going to take a bit of a look at the different generations that we see in the workplace and a bit of a light-hearted view on this as well.
Yeah, without offending anybody, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll look at some stereotypes there, but also some facts, which we're really going to try and tie into these 3 areas that we think are most important in the things that people are going to be looking at next year and areas that can be most influenced, and those are technology, language and culture. So we'll explore those in a bit more detail.
Okay, so we're almost in December, so we're starting to make plans for the new year. Oh, actually we probably should have already started, I think. But
yeah, I think most people have got it in the back of their minds at least, if not actively doing something.
Internal comms professionals definitely will have done. And looking forward to 2018, you may be aware as internal comms professionals of the agency Gatehouse in the UK, who every year do a State of the Sector report, which is a fantastic read. I strongly recommend you go along and at least download the 2017 version. I know they're going through a survey currently looking to seek information for their report next year, but from this year's report they've got some great findings in terms of what are the accepted main topics, primary topics for internal comms professionals to look at in 2018.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've picked out the top 6 that we think are most relevant here. We're going to maybe talk through these and make sure we relate back to them during the rest of this presentation, because we want to make sure we're giving this some context as to why these different generations are important. Let's relate it back to the key things you're going to be focusing on in the coming year. So the things that we picked out from this report was communicating strategy, values and purpose. So we're talking a lot here about culture, about communicating the direction of the organization and the key things that are going to inform what it's like to work and be part of that organization.
Yeah, no surprise, this is usually the #1 priority for internal comms professionals from this particular report, and it's it's the reason why we get up and do this job, isn't it, to make sure that we can reinforce what the mission is for the organization.
Yeah. And then we're going to look at things like leadership communication. So internal comms professionals are now seeing their role more than ever as an extension of the leaders of businesses to get their messages out to staff, in a lot of cases to large and spread out organizations where that's actually a challenge. People are questioning, what is the direction of the business? What are our leaders doing? What's their role? What are they having an impact on?
Are they visible enough?
Exactly. So an internal comms position on this is becoming more and more prevalent.
Yeah, and I think what we're going to go through today is going to be really important when it comes to helping you get that message out to your varied colleagues across the business.
Yeah, and potentially feeding back to the leaders as well what staff are saying. If the leaders themselves are quite detached, there's a role of going in both directions with this communication.
Absolutely.
And the third point that was brought up was communicating change, which is such a key topic as internal communicators that you'll have come across numerous times. This could be anything from a major business decision that impacts all the staff there through to changes to systems and processes that are going to affect everybody or a proportion of the organisation.
Yeah, really difficult thing to do. It's an emotive issue, isn't it, change? But we know from the great work you guys are doing that you're making it easier for organisations to go through these upheavals in some cases, and certainly around digital transformations.
So let's move on to the other three that are going to be key areas next year. Enhancing line manager communications, sorry. So we're kind of looking here at the idea of the internal comms role isn't necessarily to directly converse with staff and push messages to staff, but actually it's through other channels like people's line managers. Maybe think of this as a branch manager in retail or someone that manages a group of people that aren't as connected as everybody else. It's a really key challenge to help them pass on that information.
Yeah, and I think the real challenge, the main challenge, sorry, is that this can be a weak link in the change for internal comms, that you do all the work to get your message out there, to reinforce the strategy, values and purpose and to represent the leadership communications. But at the point where the manager's cascading it to their team, it's easy for misinterpretations or the correct messaging not to actually land. So this is always going to be high on the agenda.
Most of these things are going to be underpinned by digital strategy. So this was often a IT challenge. It's technology at the end of the day, and IT have led and owned a lot of this. But we're seeing more and more of a role of communicators in the digital strategy because fundamentally they are the channels that you'll use to get different messages out there. So we're seeing more synergy in those areas between IT and communications and other areas of the business.
Yeah, which I think directly leads on to measurement, doesn't it? That one of the benefits of digital is that we've got all the great analytics around it, and interpreting what that means and how the digital transformation and strategy is actually impacting the organisation, and making sure you can tweak and change directions if necessary. That measurement really does need to be fed back into the organisation. Just having the numbers, the data in your ivory tower doesn't solve all the issues. So communicating those measurements, making sure everybody's aligned with them is really important.
I think this is traditionally quite a weak area of internal communications. In a lot of cases, if you think to your website and marketing, data there has been prevalent for years, and it's such an important factor in that. And it's really only starting to come in as a standard, a must-have to internal communications over the last couple of years. It's really important.
Think about paper, channels, print.
Yeah.
Even television, radio. It's never been that easy to get the measurement back, is it?
And I guess it's given you some ammo for why you're needed to do your job, but also the successes as well, which is really important.
Yeah, building that credibility.
Great. So let's bear these in mind as we go through the different generational groups and start to think about the different types of people that are within the workplace. Because at the end of the day, people are at the heart of communications here. We don't believe that one communication style fits all. People talk to each other in different ways. When you're speaking to people from different audiences, you adjust the way that you work. It's a natural way of doing things. So why should your communication be a one-size-fits-all approach? It doesn't make a lot of sense. So what we're going to do here is we're going to review the core generations that are prevalent in the workplace and maybe start to build a picture as to how we might use this to inform the way that we communicate. So that introduces in the different generational groups that we're going to go through. And this is going to be quite an interesting topic, I think, because when we were doing our research, we really struggled to actually nail down some specifics here. People had different ideas. There were some quite interesting, funny, and maybe inappropriate stereotypes that we came across. But we think we've got a best estimate of the consensus here that we can at least base as a starting point.
Yeah, we put a lot of research in here. There's academic reports on these generational differences, going all the way through to amusing articles which you feel are a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it makes it difficult to actually cut through the noise and pick out what are the generations themselves, what are the naming conventions, what are the years of birth for them. And so what we're going to do is we look through and we think that we've got about the average, haven't we, across all these?
I think so. So let's actually introduce them before we talk about them in a bit more detail. We've got the baby boomers, General consensus was these people were born within that date range, and they're now around the ages of 53 to 74, so well established in the workplace.
Yeah, we're talking post-war.
Yeah.
That baby boom, which was a term that was introduced after somebody wrote a book about it, the boomers in the early 80s. I want to point out at this juncture that they might not all look like this. That's probably important to say. If you're a boomer, I'm getting there myself. That's
I think it's
a stereotype, shall we say?
Yeah, we're going to present them here, and then we're going to go into some of those stereotypes, and we'll probably say it a few times. Yeah. These aren't necessarily the opinions of Interact. This is what we found online, and if you go and Google some of these things, I'm sure you'll see similar types of content.
That's one for the lawyers. Well done, George.
So let's bring in the rest of the groups. We've got Generation X, who are in the age range of 36 to 52. We've got Generation Y, otherwise known as Millennials. We will use the terms interchangeable here because a lot of data says Generation Y, but most of the information that's out there uses the term Millennials. And then we've got Generation Z, the real emerging group that are still to be really determined as to what and who they are. But this is the general consensus. You can see it's quite a wide age range there, an 8-year-old versus a 22-year-old. But this group, otherwise known as Centennials, are something that people are starting to talk about
they're
now.
Definitely in the workplace, aren't they?
Yeah, for sure. So let's actually go into these groups and now have a look at some of these stereotypes. So as I said, these aren't all the opinions of Interact. But I also think there's another point to mention here is, before we get too much further with this, is the question was raised to me at a seminar once where we were talking about a similar topic to this, and someone said, isn't this just segregation? Aren't we excluding people here by putting them into groups and saying that they must fit in that type of category, and it's making people alienated if they don't feel like that? And I can completely understand that point. It's a logical response. I think what we're trying to do here with these generations is suggest that by grouping people into typical trends that we can hopefully back up with some facts later on, that it gives you more of a chance of including everybody, that you're not missing people by using just one form of communication that doesn't resonate with half your audience, but you're taking into account those considerations and adjusting slightly how you do your communications and other activities to take that into account. So that's really what we're trying to get out of this in terms of...
We're going to dive into this, aren't we, as we go?
Right. So let's maybe have a little bit of fun as well and look at some of these stereotypes. So this is the sort of things that were coming up when we did some research online. We read some different articles, publications, and so on and so. So let's have a look at this baby boomer group first. These are the sort of things that we picked up when we did our research. So some good traits of them being a loyal type of people, careerists, seeing some value in being part of an organization for a long time. But if you look at the negatives, these people are supposedly out of touch, disinterested in new things, and can't operate technology. You know, they never knew what the internet was and all this sort of stuff. And, you know, it's really interesting comments that we read. But they're the sort of things. Yeah. So let's move on to Generation X. These guys are supposedly negative cynics and poor team players.
They used to be known as slackers.
Right, okay, well, there you go. So I'm sure these types of things were said at the time when they were the new emerging group, and it's probably how these things work.
Baby boomers were probably accused of that as well, to be fair. They got this do-it-yourself attitude, you know, get up and go, quite entrepreneurial, with emphasis on family time, that work-life balance, which is interesting. I'm sure that's common across many generations, but this is particular trait of Generation X. And a really interesting phrase we heard about Generation X is that tech, video games, fast food, fashion, and space exploration sounds about right for Gen X.
Yeah, so that makes it sound like quite a fun group of people. But if you think about what happened in the world over those years when these people were growing up, and actually the influence that they have had as a group on technology. People seem to think technology is a millennial and younger thing, but
recently.
But it's been informed by a lot of this group. So
I think it might also be worth pointing out that of all the generations we read about, this is the one with the fewest negative traits that have been reported. And it makes you wonder if it's the Generation X that's actually writing these articles.
Yeah, maybe. So let's move on to Millennials. And we're going to spend a little bit more time on this group because this seems to be the real big discussion point at the moment. I think Baby Boomers and Gen X have maybe been decided as to what type of people they are, rightly or wrongly. But this group is still a little bit up for debate in terms of what they're like. So we're going to focus on this group a little bit more.
Yeah, and the actual section that we're in was how many millennials does it take to change a light bulb? That's actually a BBC article I saw last week, and it kind of sums up what's been said about these people, or this generation, which is split by quite a wide age range as well.
So a couple of things that came up was things like a motivated group of people. There was some, I guess, science, you could say, behind this, or social science behind this, that millennials supposedly have high student loan debt, more unemployment, less wealth versus, for example, being able to purchase a house and so on. And there's an argument that says this actually makes a group really hungry to work and hungry to succeed. So there's some arguments to say that there's a lot of benefits in millennials and their startup culture that they have there. But what we do see is this idea of a sense of entitlement, that things should come easy to them, and that, you know, they move between jobs quite quickly, looking for the next exciting thing.
That they got trophies at school just for taking part.
Yeah. So let's actually have a look at some of the things we found when we were looking at this group. You can do this yourself and go on to Google, or other search engines are available, to conduct an exercise like this, and you can type in millennials are so-and-so, and I'm sure you can try this for the other groups as well. But what you'll see is the first things are, it's they're lazy, they're the worst, entitled.
Yeah, just make sure you've got safe search on.
Yeah. But actually when you look at things like publications, these were quite funny. Millennials have officially ruined brunch, and millennials are killing the napkin industry. Blame millennials for the vanishing bar of soap, and millennials are killing the golf industry. Really obscure things that apparently millennials' fault. It was quite interesting to see that.
All these fingers pointed at them.
And the strange thing about this is, you know, you get real
Time magazine, Steam Journal, writing headlines like millennials are lazy, entitled narcissists who still live with their parents. But, you know, on the flip side, they do go on to say that they will save us all, which is good to know.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on to Generation Z just to wrap this up. We're not going to spend too much time on this group, but it is worth mentioning that these are just about entering the workforce, or are going to be entering the workforce in the future. So it's a group that is going to have some influence once the millennials have maybe concluded with their influence.
Yeah, there's not a great deal of research around this particular generation as yet, but I'm sure as we go through the years, we'll see a lot more as their influence on society and culture in general increases.
I think the key thing with this group is that they're kind of seen as this turbocharged millennial, but I think the main point to pull from this is the concept that they are true digital natives. This is a group of people that have only known the world with the internet and devices like iPhones and computers and so on. It's been a true digital experience for them since they were old enough to remember.
Yeah.
Okay, so they were the overall stereotypes. I'm sure people will heavily disagree with a lot of those and believe that they're wrong and so on. As I say, we were just reporting on these because I think it shows the confusion, some of the negative things, some of the assumed positives as well that aren't particularly useful. So what we really want to do is strip this down to some facts, some things that we know are true, some empirical evidence, or at least something that we can relate to that's true in society. As I said at the start, we're going to do that through three areas: technology, language, and culture. So we'll move on to that technology part and go through this a bit more. Okay, so we talked about the internal comms goals of 2018 was digital strategy, and it's going to impact internal comms because of the different tools that are available. And we're seeing now such a huge range of things emerging, from tools like collaboration tools like Slack and Microsoft Teams, through to artificial intelligence, voice assistants, a whole range of different things that are being put out there now.
There's so many tools to choose from. I saw a survey saying that they estimate the average knowledge worker is using around 12 different applications in an average week. So the use of technology really does impact us, as well as helping us do our work and make us as productive as possible. It can also be seen as a distraction. We've got some examples there. You mentioned Slack and Teams. How about these, you know, digital assistants, voice? We can talk about voice, can't we, as we go through?
Yeah. Okay. So let's maybe bring this back to some areas where we know we've got some evidence, and one of those is devices that people use. So a 2015 BuzzStream survey of 1,200 people looked at primary device people use for content consumption based on some of those different generations. And there's a couple of things we're going to point out here. I think the first one is the prevalent use of mobile as a preferred device for consuming content by the Gen Y, the millennial group, significantly higher than the other generations. They're much more readily prepared to use their mobile as a source of receiving information.
Yes, and that's the point, isn't it? It's about the consumption. It's not exclusive, because as we can see in the rest of the graph, that if you combine laptop and desktop into computers, if you say that represented by computers, it still massively dominates content consumption, although clearly the trends are there to move away from that. I also think personally that I'm interested to see that if we look at sorry, I've clicked forward. Tablets is got higher usage comparatively than Gen X and Gen Y.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
which is a bit of a surprise if you look at the rest of the data out there.
Mm. We're also seeing the emerging trends that we mentioned before around digital voice assistants. So this is essentially the device on your phone where you can press a button and ask your phone to go and find some information for you without having to open the phone, type something.
Don't say any of the names.
I know, I almost did a few times there, and then all our phones will start binging. And,
the lady in the can. Oh.
Yeah. But there's a couple of interesting stats here, and I think that the key point we're looking at here is that the confirmed stats from 2016 show a percentage use amongst the generations, led by Gen Y, the millennials, as we'd expect. But I think the key thing here is the significant growth in that area. People are going to be much more prepared to use this type of technology. It's an emerging tool that we're going to see more and more things lining up to that type of stuff, bots and that sort of ability to interrogate and ask a system without actually going into a search or navigating a structure that might have been done before.
This goes back to your point earlier, George, where you're saying that using these generational differences is about understanding how to decide on the channels you're using. So you can see in this particular case that usage among baby boomers and Gen X is pretty much static across all those years, but the increase with Gen Y is significant, and these are considerations that we need to make when we're talking about technology in 2018.
Yeah. So let's move on to app usage. So this is a graph showing monthly mobile app hours per user. And if you think about what an app is, the ability to create the application on your phone for a certain purpose, we're seeing apps for everything now. Going out of the workplace, obviously games, BBC News, things like control your heating from your phone. You've all heard those adverts where you can log on to an app and turn your heating on from wherever you are in the world, as long as you've got access to the internet. And of course, we're seeing that come through in the workplace as well. Applications for expenses, for accessing information, for receiving news. So
simply email.
Yeah, that's true. So it's really important to see what some of those trends are. And I think the key thing here is that they are well used. There's a lot of, all the groups are using this significantly, as we expect, led by the millennials, who are more conducive to this type of technology, having grown up with it. But what's quite interesting as well that we picked out, again, is some tablet usage in the baby boomer generation is higher than other generations. So mobile, yes, it's important, but let's not assume that people aren't using tablets and iPads and similar types of tools. You may find a certain proportion of your workforce use them quite prevalently, especially if you issue them, like I've seen some organisations do to some of their staff.
I think my use as a Generation Xer would be off the chart for the amount of apps that I've got.
Exactly. So people use it differently, as we said at the start, but these are the trends that we're seeing. And I think one clear trend that is emerging at the moment is Generation Z. So we talked about this group starting to come into the workplace, or they will be over the coming years. They have been born and bred to use these types of tools because they've experienced it from day one. So we can see that in the usage stats.
That's just their normal.
So I guess you can think about this when you are pushing out communications is, how are people going to read the news and the content you produce? Are they going to look at it on the internet via a web page, or may they choose to engage with it via some kind of app? It's something you can use in that way. So what about push notifications? This is something that we're seeing more and more about. And I think
this is contentious.
It is a little bit contentious because you could argue that some people don't like receiving notifications, and if anything, the stats kind of back this up. You can see that the millennial age groups are happy to agree to an app's request to allow push notifications, so that pop-up message that you get when some kind of activity happens that is shown on your phone home screen. They are willing to turn these on. They like that immediacy of information. You can see in stark contrast how that changes as you go up the older generations. And if you can think about this, if you think you've got any family, cousins or friends, and then you look at their kids that are, 12-year-olds using Snapchat, Instagram, just constant notifications. I think they probably get more notifications in a day than I get in a month. It's just the way that a lot of people consume information. So it's a real trend here to say if you're going to push out information via an app using push notifications, you have a group of people that are incredibly willing to receive that type of information, and a group that are a little bit more tentative to agree to that type of information getting across to them in that manner.
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially when you looked at the previous stats that said that the use of apps is high in all of the generations, but the willingness to receive these notifications very different. A really interesting stat.
And I guess that comes into, going back to the workplace now, maybe the choice of what people do receive within the group of push notifications. So if you're trying to push out a key policy, in this case around things like technology and GDPR and security, you might want everyone to read that, and they've got no choice on the matter, and you need to push that out. But users might choose to say, get notifications about a particular area of the company they're interested in. You may want to be able to give them some choice as to what they get. Okay, so let's move on to the next section around language.
Yeah, I think it leads nicely into language, isn't it?
Because I think the key thing here is that we've talked about the devices and the ways of accessing type of information, but what about the information itself and the style and how this looks? So let's explore this a little bit more. During our research, we found some quite interesting points here, I think, when we did our Googling of different things. The first thing that we saw was that these sort of things are prevalent nowadays. We've got a movie about emojis, or emoticons, as I'd have called them when I was growing up, and games where you play it by putting together different emoji icons and creating phrases. Sounds like quite a good laugh, but the point is that this type of way of communicating has made its way into culture nowadays. This isn't something a few people are using on a mobile phone.
No.
This is completely prevalent
in
society, and I think this stuff sort of proves that. There wouldn't be a market for these things if they weren't well used, but they are.
But we're not suggesting people go back to hieroglyphics
no.
for their method of communication. But it's amazing how quickly this has entered the public consciousness, isn't it?
Yeah, and we can see some evidence of that by things like Time did an article on forget words. A lot of millennials say GIFs and emojis communicate their thoughts better than English. Do we even need the written language for some forms of communication? Maybe you don't, and it shows that certain groups are quite open to picking up this type of stuff. Let's look at another example of this. For millennials, the headline is the content. 1 of 5 millennials say they've exclusively read headlines. And I think I've got some evidence of this. If you think about the workplace and someone says, did you read that article on BBC yesterday or today? Actually, what I hear people say now, more than ever, is, did you see that headline on the BBC today? They've glanced at the headline, they've decided what the news is, and now they're having a conversation about it. I think of this as you're scrolling through your mobile, reading news. It's kind of a scroll and grab scenario. You're flicking through, you see something, you take it in, you move on.
But it's also a factor of how much information we've got at our fingertips. If you think back to when we were younger, sorry to lump you in with my age group, George, but we had less access to information. We'd watch the news maybe once a day, read a newspaper, and we had time to digest all the bits of information flying at us. Now, we're inundated by information. We have to be very choosy, and if it means just getting all your news from headlines, then so be it.
So we're hopefully going to give you a way to help you out with this shortly. But I think we need a little more evidence around video consumption, because this is something a lot of organisations talk about, and we're seeing that that the younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, are much more likely, in the case of Generation Z versus Gen X, twice as likely to watch videos on a daily basis. And this is a key form of communication that you can potentially use.
Yeah, video's still not so prevalent in the workplace, and there's technical reasons for that, isn't there, in terms of bandwidth and cost and devices that people may be using. But I think now it's at its peak that it's ever been in terms of the workplace.
So let's bring this back into the workplace again and talk about how people consume news and content. So you can see here that people are obviously receiving their information online and via social media. It's such a key part to this.
No real surprise there.
No, not really. And if you think about your challenges that you're going to be looking at in 2018 around communicating leadership, information and key changes, you're going to want to make sure that the media you use is right.
Yeah.
You're not going to go too far wrong with online and social media. That's a fact, and I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. What we thought was quite interesting here was the prevalence of print. It's not a huge volume, but if you think about who these people could be, in your workplace, this could be people that don't have a device.
Yeah.
Someone in retail, someone in a warehouse, in distribution, in travel, that don't actually have access to either of two on the left-hand side. And maybe this is something that should be considered. A timeline post or an update on the internet might just not suffice. You might want to do some other types of communication around that as well. There's different options available.
Yeah, it's more set in stone as well, print. It captures a moment in time more than maybe a social stream might do. I was with an organisation just last week who still to this day use various methods of print as their primary way of communicating with the workforce, because most of the workforce are frontline staff without allocated devices, but for them it's still quite an expensive medium, and that's probably why you see online being heralded so much.
And it's quite difficult when you don't have really strong intranets put in place and other types of tools to underpin this, which is why the technology part we mentioned before is quite important. But let's maybe leave you on this section with a methodology that you can take away that we think can actually help you with this challenge. And we call this methodology called bite, snack and meal. So what we're thinking about here is the concept of some people consume information in different ways, as we've said. So your millennials might decide, well, actually, I'm just going to consume a lot of my information from a headline. So your initial piece of content needs to have a good headline, maybe a good image behind it, a really simple summary that people can glance at and get the message. If they're going to choose to receive information that way, you need to make sure you've covered that part particularly well.
Yeah, there's probably a trick to that, isn't there, to make your headlines or that bite really digestible, shall we say?
Yeah.
The eye-catching, really.
Yeah. The snack part it could be a video that we talked about before. It could be a one-page overview of the communication. Maybe your leaders want to share a big strategy for 2018, the vision of the company, and that's actually a really large document. So a quick headline with the key facts, an overview, or maybe a video recorded presentation by the CEO, and then the meal would be the full 50-page PDF attached that maybe someone who looks after a whole division would want to read that in full detail. So this methodology you can kind of use to any type of communication and think, how can we make this easy for people to consume?
Yeah, to consume, but also decide how much they need to actually delve into it, knowing that there's going to be a lot of information supporting it. We saw Sky Betting and Gaming doing this to great effect when they published their next year's strategy. They have nice images with quick headlines about the bite, luring the user in before hitting them with, like you say, a video, maybe some photographs, and then straight onto like the nitty-gritty around the strategy, the stuff that maybe the executives would be interested in more than any junior members of staff. But it helps you make the choice of how much you want to learn.
And obviously your generational trends that we talked about are going to inform this, but also things like your workplace personas, the different functions and roles that people have in the workplace are going to tailor this as well.
Yeah, if you're out in the field, you may just not have the opportunity to read the full document, but knowing that there's a quick headline that's eye-catching, that raises your awareness of it, then allowing you to maybe see that quick introductional video, that's just helping you to cater to the different, not age groups, but the different working experiences.
Okay, so let's move on to culture and try and give a few points here, because the reality is this is a broad topic. So maybe let's have a quick think about why it's important and maybe start to look at how we might measure this.
Sure.
So the first thing that we did was we found an interesting point by the US Bureau of Labor that looked at the median number of years of an employee with their current employer. And I don't think it's any surprise, this data. I think it's well established that millennials, and in particular younger people at that point in their lives, move jobs more. But you can see how significant this difference is between the younger generations and the more settled older generations. And we could do lots of studies and provide lots of evidence around why this is important. You can go and have a look at the cost of employees leaving and the cost of training and all that sort of stuff. We'll kind of take that as a given for now. But let's actually look at why this is important in the sense of if people are moving, then potentially the company could be losing money, losing skills, and so on. So how can you keep those people retained? There's a lot of different ways to do that. But how do you measure that? That's a real challenge, isn't it? And there's a couple of ways that we think are quite interesting.
So if you're in the UK, your employers have recently been through the Best Company Survey, which is, there is a US version of this, where organizations want to get an anonymous feedback from their employees about what it means to them to work there and try and measure engagement with some scientific survey questions. Interact ourselves have been through this recently and sitting on tenterhooks, waiting to hear the outcome. But this is something that when we were talking about this last year after having the debrief of how we'd done from the survey, I found it really interesting to hear the feedback from younger members of the team whose interests were very different than mine. As a dad who's a Generation Xer, I wanted to know that there was some sort of comfort provided by my organisation, such as life insurance and things like that.
Yeah.
Whereas younger members of the team, what were they interested in?
Well, I don't know, I'm not trying to speak for them, but yeah.
But it was more social, wasn't it?
It was a social purpose.
It was a social side.
Yeah.
And we all go through different phases in life and have different priorities, but I think best companies and tools like this allow you to tap into that and really get the feedback and understand the priorities and motivations of your colleagues.
Yeah. And from a generational perspective, this is quite important because we're starting to see the millennials as what I describe as the culture builders in the workplace, where they are becoming more prevalent in key roles. Hayden, I think you said before that workplace leadership was expected to be 2/3 millennials by 2024.
Yeah.
Not too distant future, they'll have such a key sway in how things are done within organisations.
Yeah.
So I think we wanted to look at some examples where we've seen organisations tailor the way they do things or be influenced by the millennial and younger generations in terms of how they operate in their workplace.
Yeah, so just a few examples. There's a couple of our customers here. First of all, we've got ASOS. If you're in the UK, no doubt you'll have heard of these guys. They're an online retailer of fashion, very, very popular organisation. Seen some incredible growth over the years, record-breaking growth actually. And part of their secret with such a young workforce is they've seen that having very social, communal areas helps the flow of information, collaboration, and also that sense of engagement with your organisation. If they want, a lot of these people want to work in modern environments. And we saw earlier when we looked at millennials that they have got a strong work ethic, and companies know that if you can bring in some of the more social elements into the workplace, then you might get more out of them. You might get more hours, if you take it down to that. I'm not accusing ASOS of this, by the way, but it's certainly something you see in Silicon Valley. Another example of an Interact customer is AO.com. They're, again, an online retailer, this time not in fashion, but in white goods, televisions, electronics, essentially. Like ASOS, they also have a wonderful office. It's probably the most impressive office I've ever visited personally. With, as you can see here, communal areas, people in the typical game of pool and foosball. But one thing that AO have done, not in terms of the working environment, but in terms of their content on their intranet, which I thought was really interesting, is every Friday they actually publish news using animated GIFs, which, if we go back to that emoji example earlier, they're grabbing this and running with it. They know what gets people talking, what gets people engaged, and how to drive traffic to their intranet, which is one of their primary communication tools. And so that's really important. I just like those two examples. There is a third example I've got. This is not from a customer of Interacts. This is from another fashion retailer, again, with a very young workforce, company called Misguided. You may have heard of them. Again, a really impressive growth story. I was very lucky to see a talk at a conference a few weeks ago by the head of people, and she talked about some of the tools and things they talk about in their business, that it's all focused around selfies. They call their colleagues, or they refer to themselves as unicorns, which you probably wouldn't find in a law firm or similar kind of organisation, a bit more conservative. And yeah, they've created a great working space. They have fun. They really tap into the interests of their colleagues, and as a result, they do actually have a really great retention level, which, as you said earlier, is probably hard to achieve. So 3 examples there of organisations who are really doing very well, doing all the right things in targeting a particular demographic that works for them. I'm not saying this works for everybody, but they're just 3 examples of some particular successes, reversing some of the trends of job hopping, as we saw earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. So might not be something you can influence directly in terms of how the office is laid out, but you can at least understand what sort of things your staff are looking for, or the type of people you're employing, and bring some of that in as you can.
And that's what we're saying all along. There's no right or wrong answer here, and you can't be that specific. But what you can do is learn from it and try and play to your strengths.
Yeah. There's a couple of other simple things that you can do. So we're seeing a lot of organisations target groups based on certain information. So let's say you've got a couple of tickets to a concert in London that you want to give away, or another employees can't go, so they want to pass it on. Maybe you might say, well, actually we want to tag everybody that's in our London office that has going to concerts or music as an interest on their profile, and we want to send a push notification to all those people to say these tickets have been used in 2 hours, who wants it first to kind of respond. It could be something like that, but a lot of millennials like that sort of thing of being able to go and get involved and giveaways and all that sort of stuff.
Absolutely.
So there's loads of things that you can do. Here's just one tiny example where you need to line it to your culture and promote the change that you want to promote in your culture. It's different for everybody.
We've already seen that they're open to notifications, and this can drive habits and behaviours. Again, play to your strengths. If you've got a particular demographic, then help them help themselves.
Yeah. Great. So let's have a really quick summary of a couple of key points, and then we'll maybe handle a couple of questions before we wrap up.
Yeah, we want to get people to the next meetings, don't we?
Yeah.
But I think we've got a little bit of time to summarise what we've done, what we've been talking about, and then answer some questions.
Yeah, so let's tackle a couple of key things. So first of all, we did see that there's a real key prevalent use of mobiles, particularly by millennials over the other generations. Everyone still has one, but how they choose to use that is very different. And I think that's the key point. Some people prefer push notifications, some people prefer to communicate using certain ways. And if you think about the apps using your workplace, such as your intranet and HR system, you're going to need to take that into account and make sure it's communicated in the right way. We gave you the takeaway of the Bite Snack Meal. Hopefully that's going to be useful for how you promote your content in the future.
Yeah, simple but effective. But we've seen when we've advised our customers around this that adoption, participation increases as a result.
Yeah, it's just a quick hit to make sure that piece of communication is now relevant to a wider audience. And finally, the millennial workplace culture. This is a big thing. It's getting even bigger as these people start to take on leadership roles. It's impacting how things are done now. So how you promote your culture and what you do in the future needs to take this into account.
Yeah, you've got some time. These are our tips for 2018. It's a matter of fact that these younger generations will dominate the workforce in a short amount of time as the older generations leave the leadership roles or retire. So we hope we've given you some interesting facts, figures, hope we've debunked some myths as well, and given you some actionable advice to take away, and wish you the best of luck for 2018.
Yeah. Absolutely. But let's hopefully tackle up a couple of your questions now. So have we got a couple of questions, Emma? Right, one sec.
Okay. So this is a question from Claire, and she says, we're starting to use Slack, but adoption isn't widespread. Do you have any advice?
Okay. So that's one of the tools we mentioned in the technology area. So we are seeing more people using these type of collaboration tools that are
like an alternative to email, really, aren't they?
Yeah, they're sort of
more about Facebook than Gmail or Hotmail.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess that they're things that can be just turned on and pop up quite quickly, which has some benefits that get certain groups talking, but I guess it's often outside of that communication of change. Why are we using this as an organization? Who else might need to use this? Have we thought this through? Have we got another system that does the same thing? So sometimes that's a barrier, is it's thrown up by a department and maybe not everyone across the organization understands it and understands the benefits. So it's quite a tough one, that.
It is a tough one, as you say, George. Going back to those 6 priorities for 2018, communicating change and digital strategy. If you want Slack to work, then you're going to have to put the hard yards in.
It's got to be part of that, hasn't it?
Answer the what's in it for me question. Help them understand what it's for, why they should use it, and what benefit they'll get from it. And after that, it should come a bit easier.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I think we may have got time for one more.
I think we're probably... Should we squeeze it in?
Yeah, really quickly. We've got a question from Jonathan. Anybody? We've got 3 or 4 more questions. We'll send them out in the follow-up, but this is a really quick one. Is there a risk that this could be viewed as a form of segregation?
Yeah, so
you mentioned this earlier.
Yeah, I briefly highlighted that people don't identify as within a certain group, so they are technically a millennial or technically a baby boomer, but they have completely different interests that don't match those groups. As we said at the start, they're really just best guess, and they're not going to apply to everybody. There's millions of people within those groups. But I think the key point stands that you're trying to go away from doing a single type of communication that will exclude people by its nature because it doesn't fit the needs of your audience, to taking into account these different groups and just tailoring your approach slightly to try and have more of an impact and be more inclusive with your audience. And I think in your workplace, when you start to look at people's roles and responsibilities, their functions, where they're based, you start to get into more workplace personas as well, where that's going to have an influence as well. But I think it's a way to include people rather than exclude.
Excellent stuff. That was great advice, George. So that's it, I think.
Yeah.
We'll get the recording out to you all. Thank you so much for sharing the last 45 minutes or so with George and myself. If you have any questions following the session, feel free to reach out. You'll have Emma Bramwell's details there. We're happy to come and talk to you, maybe share more experiences with our customers and even talk about Interact if you're interested. So watch this space, loads to talk about, and we'll just leave it, say bye.
Yeah, bye and good luck for 2018. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Bye.